This question came in on a video about the basics of writing VBA code. Now the question isn't quite related to the contents of the video, but it is still VBA related, so I guess we'll let them off. So what this person wants to be able to do is use a single spin button on a worksheet to change the value of one single cell within the range A1 to A5, but based on the cell that's currently selected. But they were having a bit of trouble getting that to work, so let's see if we can help them out. To get started, I've created a new Excel workbook and just typed in a range of numbers in cells A1 to A5. The next thing I'll do is draw a spin button on the background of the worksheet. To do that, I can head to the Developer tab. If you don't have that displayed, you can right-click on any tab in the ribbon and choose Customize the ribbon, and then select the checkbox for the Developer tab. In roughly the middle of the Developer tab, there's a button called Insert, and in there are two types of controls, Form Controls and ActiveX Controls. We're going to go with ActiveX Controls for this example, so I'll find the spin button, click on that tool, and then click once on the background of the worksheet to draw one. I can rearrange it if I like. If I want it to snap to the exact sizes of the cells I'm drawing it in, I can hold down the Alt key, and you'll see that it'll snap to the edges of cells as you resize it and you drag it around. It's a little excessive, I think, but anyway, I'm going to go with it. There are a few properties of the spin button now that I want to change. I can view the properties in a couple of ways. There's a Properties button here on the Developer tab of the ribbon, or I can right-click on the object and choose Properties, and my Properties button will appear somewhere. I can change a few different things. I can change its name. Spin button 1's a fairly generic name. I could update that if I wanted to. I'm not going to bother. I can change the linked cell property. That's the important one. We're going to change this programmatically shortly, but just to demonstrate the basics of this, I'm going to type in the cell reference A1. We can set a min and a max value for the spin button, so it won't go above or below the values we enter here. So I'm going to change my max down to 20. And then finally, the one last thing we can do is change the small change property, and that controls how much is added to or subtracted from the value of the cell when you click the up and down buttons. So let's change that to 2. So having done all that, we now need to exit to the design mode of Excel. So I'm going to click the design mode button, and it doesn't matter what cell I've got selected at the moment, the linked cell property of that control will be remembered. So as I click the up and the down button, you'll see that it changes the contents of the cell that it's currently linked to. The next thing I'd like to do is change the linked cell property of this spin button whenever I click on a cell in the worksheet. And to do that, I'm going to use the Selection Change property of the worksheet object. One quick way to get to the code behind that particular event is to right-click on the worksheet name at the bottom of the screen and choose to View Code. When you do that, it opens up the Visual Basic Editor. You may notice that the Properties window has been stolen by Excel, so if you wanted to bring the Properties window back to where it should be, the simplest thing to do is press the F4 key on your keyboard while you're in the VB editor. You can also go to the View menu and choose the Properties window there as well. So I'm currently looking at the code of Sheet 1 at the moment. To get access to the events, I need to use these drop-down lists up at the top. First of all, I need to access the event of the worksheet. The spin button itself has lots of events, and we could do this using the spin button event, but it's, I think, slightly easier using a Worksheet Selection Change event just to update this one single property. So we're going to select Worksheet, and that provides us with the default event of the worksheet, which is the Selection Change, and that's the one that we want. There are other events of the worksheet, which you can see here, but we're going to stick with Selection Change. This is triggered every time you click on a different cell in the worksheet. So all I'm going to do is, first of all, refer to my spin button object. A quick way to find that object name is to press Ctrl and Spacebar, and then start typing in the name of the object, spin button 1, and when it appears in the list, hit the Tab key to have the rest of the keyword typed in. We've already seen that that object has got a linked cell property, so if we type in a full stop and then refer to the linked cell, we can then make that equal to the property. The linked cell property is a string property, so we need to pass in a reference to a cell address, not a reference to a range object. So I could, for instance, say A2, for example, but I want to reference the address of the cell that I've just selected when this event is triggered. So what I'm going to do is change this to say equal to active cell, and then use the address property of that cell. So simple enough so far. Let's give that one a quick test if we switch back into Excel. If I select cell A2 and click the up and the down arrows, you'll see that it changes cell A2, cell A5. I'm not going to bother checking all of them, don't worry, but you can see that whichever cell I've selected, it now updates the linked cell property to match. The next thing I'd like to do is restrict the linked cell property to only cells selected in range A1 to A5. Currently, if I click outside of that range, remember the selection change event is triggered whenever you select a different cell on the worksheet, my spin button now affects that cell, and that's not quite what we want. So to do this, what we're going to do is use the Intersect method to check whether the cell we've selected is inside that range. To do that, we can switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to add an if statement above this line of code in the same event. I'm going to say if not application.intersect. The intersect method can take a range of ranges, up to 30 of them. We're only going to pass in 2 different ranges. I'm going to pass in the active cell first, and then I'm going to refer to range A1 to A5 on this worksheet. So I'm going to say sheet1.range A1 to A5. I'll close 2 sets of parentheses at the end there. So if the intersect method finds that the 2 cells or the 2 ranges overlap in any way, the intersect method returns a reference to the overlapping range. If those 2 ranges don't overlap, then the intersect method returns nothing. So we can check if not intersect is nothing, then we know that we have selected a cell that's within that valid range. So only then are we going to update the linked cell property. So we can say end if at the end. And if we then switch back to Excel, we can select a cell in range A1 to A5. Any of those will work. But if we select a cell outside of that range, you'll see that it doesn't affect the selected cell. It only affects the last cell that we did select in range A1 to A5. As an alternative to remembering the last valid cell that we selected, we could detach the spin button from any cell on the worksheet entirely if we click outside of the valid range. So in order to do that, we can switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, and we can simply add an else clause to this if statement, so that if we have clicked on a cell outside of that range, we can just set the linked cell property of that spin button to an empty string. Having done that, we can switch back to Excel. And if I click again on a cell that's within the range, that's all working quite nicely. But if we click outside of the range, now clicking the spin button does absolutely nothing at all. We've detached it from any linked cell in the worksheet. Having the spin button remember the last valid cell that we selected could potentially be useful. But it would be even more useful if we could indicate to the end user which cell in that range was currently active. We can do that with some simple formatting changes. Let's head back to the Visual Basic Editor. And once we've established that we're in a valid range and we've changed the linked cell property, we could also change some background colours of our range. Let's first of all clear any colours of any cells in that range at all. So I'm going to say sheet1.range A1 to A5.interior.color_index equals XL none to clear any existing background colour. Then I just want to change the colour of the active cell, so I can say ActiveCell.interior, and I'll use the colour property to give myself a bit more choice than colour index, and I'll make this equal to one of the RGB colours. Let's go for RGB. Let's go for RGB orange. Why not? That should stand out enough. So, having done that, we can switch back into Excel, and again, if we click outside of the range, nothing happens. Oops, I forgot to also comment out my else clause. Sorry, beg pardon. Let's just switch back to the VB editor, and I'm just going to highlight my 2 lines, the else clause and the spin button linked cell equals an empty string, and comment out those 2 lines using the comment block button. If you don't have that toolbar displayed, you can right click at the top of the screen and choose the edit toolbar. Okay, so let's give this a quick test. If I click into a cell in the range, it highlights it in orange, and if I click the up and down arrows, it changes. And if I click away from that range, the spin button still updates that last selected cell. I can then click on a different cell in the same range and a different one, and you can see the colour changes automatically when I select it. And clicking outside of the range still allows the spin button to control the last selected cell. There is one more potential problem we should just have a quick look at attempting to solve. What if the user decides to type a value into one of these cells in range A1 to A5? Not a big problem as long as it's a valid number in the range of numbers we've allowed by the spin button, but if we were to do something like type in owl, for example, although we can type something in, the next time we click back on that cell when the linked cell property is set, that causes a runtime error. So we get a type mismatch and it fails on the line which attempts to set the linked cell property. I'm just going to hit the reset button here. Checking for whether something is a number or not is pretty straightforward. There's a function in VBA which allows us to do that. I'm just going to get rid of my else clause here just to make my code a little easier to lay out. And I'm going to add another if statement inside the one which checks if we've selected a valid cell. So I'm going to check that the cell contains a number, first of all, so we can say if is numeric. And then we can refer to the value of the cell, so we'll go for ActiveCell.value. Then we can proceed and do all the things we've asked to do. We'll finish that off with an end if, and then if we just switch back to Excel, as long as we click into a cell that contains a number in the valid range, that's all good. But if we click on the cell containing owl or anything that isn't a number, that no longer does anything. We've got it set up again so it remembers the last valid cell that we selected, so we can still use the spin button to control those, but it won't affect the cell containing text. We'd encounter a similar problem if we entered something into a cell which was a number, but it was outside the min and max range of the spin button. So if I were to type in, say, 21, I know that I set the maximum value of my spin button to 21. It's fine to type that in. But when I click back on that cell to try to set the linked cell property, once again, it fails. A slightly different message this time. It's not a type mismatch. It's not trying to store a string in a numeric property. But if I click the debug button, you'll see that it's failed again on the same line where we try to set the linked cell property. So I'm just going to hit the reset button again to stop running. And then we'll nest yet another if statement inside our two existing if statements. We'll check if the ActiveCell.value is both greater than or equal to the minimum value of our spin button. So I can say spin button 1.min and the active cell value, I'll get that right eventually, ActiveCell.value is less than or equal to spin button 1.max. Then, again, I'm just going to indent these three lines, give myself a new blank line and add another end if at the end, getting this beautiful nested statement structure. And then if we switch back to Excel, we can click on a cell inside the range with a valid value and everything works normally. But if we click on a cell that contains an invalid value, it just remembers the last valid selected cell. So there we go. Hopefully that answers the original question. Thanks for watching. See you next time.